The arena lights were blinding, the crowd roaring, and the cameras flashing. But behind that confident smile and dazzling blue cape, Owen Hart wasn't just another superstar. He was a man living in two worlds, one where laughter ruled backstage, and another where egos, pride, and danger collided under the spotlight. To the world, he was the high-flying blue blazer, the heart of entertainment. But behind that mask, few truly knew the battles he was fighting, not against opponents, but against the harsh realities of a business that rarely forgave mistakes. Owen wasn't like the others. He wasn't the loudest in the locker room or the kind of man who bragged about his fame. While his brother Brett was all discipline and determination, Owen was the prankster, the man who made everyone laugh when the pressure was unbearable. But even the kindest souls have their breaking points. In the late 1980s, before he became a WWF name, Owen was sharpening his craft in the tough, unforgiving world of Stampede wrestling, his family's own territory in Calgary. It was here that he met one of his first real enemies, a man named Bad News Allen. Allen was the kind of wrestler who didn't just play tough, he was tough. His stare alone could freeze a room, and he carried himself like someone who'd seen too much of the world to ever take a joke. Inside the ring, he wasn't there to perform, he was there to dominate, to make every rookie pay for daring to share the same canvas. Owen, young and hungry, stepped into the ring with him more than once, and every time, it felt like a war he wasn't supposed to win. Their matches weren't just physical battles, they were lessons in pain. Allen didn't care about putting on a show. He threw real punches, real slams, and made sure the kid from the Hart family earned every bruise. Brett would later recall how both brothers suffered under Allen's punishing style, but Owen learned something from it. He learned that respect in wrestling wasn't given, it was taken, sometimes through blood, sweat, and humiliation. But that lesson would shape the man he became. Years passed, and Owen's confidence grew. When both men eventually found themselves under the WWF banner, Owen was no longer the scared rookie from Stampede. He had become a refined performer, technically brilliant and beloved by fans. But fate wasn't done testing him. Once again, Owen crossed paths with Bad News Allen. Only this time, the playing field was different. Allen, now working closely with Hulk Hogan's tour schedule, was being protected by management. He was winning matches night after night with his signature finisher, the Ghetto Blaster. And that included matches against Owen, who was performing under his blue blazer persona. But Owen wasn't the kind of man to bow quietly. One night, after being pinned clean by Allen, Owen jumped right back to his feet and began posing for the crowd, smiling, waving, acting as if the loss never happened. It was a small act of defiance, but in the world of wrestling, it was a massive insult. The following night in Calgary, with the entire Hart family sitting ringside, Owen refused to lose altogether. The agent in charge had to rewrite the finish at the last minute, turning it into a disqualification to avoid chaos. Backstage, Allen was fuming. The tension between them had reached a boiling point. Before their third encounter, Allen warned the referee in no uncertain terms, "If Owen disrespects me again, I'll take him out for real." And that's exactly what he did. When Owen once again tried to celebrate after losing, Allen stormed back to the ring, blindsided him, and dropped him to the mat. Backstage, he leaned down and growled, "Let that be a lesson to you." For Owen, it was more than a warning. It was a wake-up call about how thin the line was between entertainment and real-life violence. In the ring, pride was everything. And sometimes, it could break friendships before they even began. Still, Owen never lost his sense of humor. He had a spirit that could make even the most intimidating wrestlers crack a smile. But that same sense of mischief would soon land him in trouble again, this time with one of wrestling's toughest legends, Harley Race. Harley wasn't just another veteran, he was an institution. A man who had lived through the brutal days of the NWA, where respect wasn't optional. When he invited wrestlers to his Kansas City home for dinner, it was an honor. Every wrestler knew that when Harley cooked, you treated it like a sacred ritual. But Owen couldn't resist a little fun. As Harley's famous homemade chili simmered in the kitchen, Owen quietly pulled a bottle of the hottest hot sauce he could find and poured it into the pot. When dinner was served, chaos erupted. The wrestlers gasped for air, eyes watering, tongues burning, while Owen stood off to the side, pretending to be as confused as everyone else. Laughter filled the room for a moment, but not from Harley. To him, it wasn't a joke. It was an insult to his home, his food, and his pride. Days later, Harley approached Owen backstage with a friendly smile and extended his hand. Relieved, Owen thought the legend had forgiven him, but when he reached out to shake, Harley shocked him, literally. Hidden in his palm was a small taser. The electric jolt knocked Owen off his feet, and for a brief second, even the prankster of the locker room was silent. When Brett later told the story, he laughed about it, but he knew Harley had gone too far. Still, in that era of wrestling, pranks had consequences, and every lesson came with pain. By the early 90s, Owen had built a reputation as one of the safest and most skilled wrestlers in the business. He could make anyone look good, and he rarely made mistakes. But even the most precise performers have moments that change everything. For Owen, that moment would come years later, in a match that would haunt the wrestling world forever. Because in the summer of 1997, the world would see something it wasn't ready for, a tragedy that would change 2 careers and 2 lives forever. One belonging to Owen Hart, and the other to the man who would become the biggest star of the era, Stone Cold Steve Austin. The summer of 1997 was supposed to be a golden chapter in Owen Hart's career, a chance to shine on one of the biggest stages of all, SummerSlam. The crowd was electric, the lights brighter than ever, and the story simple: Owen Hart versus the rising anti-hero, Stone Cold Steve Austin, for the Intercontinental Championship. The match was destined to be remembered, but not for the reasons anyone expected. What was supposed to make Austin a legend nearly ended his career, and shattered the bond between 2 professionals forever. The bell rang, and both men locked up with precision. Every move was crisp, every sequence sharp. Owen, always the technician, had a rhythm, smooth, methodical, and safe. But as the match built toward its climax, one miscalculation would turn that rhythm into horror. The planned spot was a sit-out tombstone piledriver, a move that demands perfect positioning. But in that split second, something went wrong. Instead of dropping to his knees, Owen fell to a seated position, and Steve Austin's head was driven directly into the mat. The impact was horrifying. Austin's body went stiff, collapsing lifelessly to the mat. The audience didn't know it yet, but he was paralyzed, unable to move, his mind racing in panic. For what felt like an eternity, the arena went quiet. Then, as if running on pure instinct, Austin somehow crawled toward Owen, rolled him up for a weak pin, and ended the match. He had just fractured his neck and bruised his spinal cord. The victory meant nothing. The damage had been done. Backstage, panic rippled through the locker room. Medical staff rushed to Austin's side as the reality of the situation sank in. A few inches, one wrong movement, and the man who would become the face of the Attitude Era might have been gone forever. Owen was devastated. He knew instantly what had happened, that a single mistake had almost ended another man's life. Wrestlers have a code: protect your opponent. And now, that sacred trust was broken. Austin was hospitalized, and the entire locker room held its breath. The business was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But this was different. This was Owen Hart, the man known for being safe, precise, and professional. The accident haunted him, but what came next hurt even more. Days passed, and Austin waited for the phone to ring. He expected a call from Owen, an apology, a message, something. But the silence stretched on. Owen never called. Why didn't he? That question became one of the most painful mysteries in their story. Bret Hart later said he begged his brother to pick up the phone, to reach out, to make it right. But Owen didn't. Maybe it was guilt, maybe pride, or maybe he just didn't know what to say. For Austin, that silence wasn't just disappointing, it was unforgivable. Years later, he said, "If I had hurt someone that bad, I'd have called them 25 times." From that day forward, a line was drawn. The friendship was gone. Austin eventually returned, but he was never the same. The injury forced him to change everything: his moves, his style, his pace. The technical brilliance was gone, replaced by a more aggressive, brawling approach that fit his new persona perfectly. Ironically, the tragedy that almost ended his career also helped create the legend of Stone Cold. But for Owen, the shadows grew darker. The same locker room that once laughed at his pranks now whispered behind his back. For the first time, Owen Hart, the safest man in the ring, was seen as dangerous. He tried to move on, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The wrestling world was about to be turned upside down by one of the most controversial events in history, the Montreal Screwjob. The night Bret Hart, Owen's brother, was publicly betrayed by Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels on live television. For the Hart family, it wasn't just a business decision, it was a knife to the heart. And for Owen, it changed everything. Bret and most of the family walked away from WWF, heading to WCW, but Owen couldn't. He was locked into a multi-year contract, trapped in a company that had just humiliated his brother on a global stage. The betrayal burned deep. Overnight, the place he once loved became a prison. He was surrounded by people he no longer trusted, working for a man he now despised. And yet he kept going, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. When Owen returned to Raw after Montreal, the crowd erupted. He stormed the ring and confronted Shawn Michaels, the man many blamed for the screw job. The rage in his eyes wasn't scripted, it was real. The confrontation was meant to blur the lines between story and reality, and it worked. For a moment, fans believed Owen Hart was back with a vengeance. Vince McMahon promised him a major push, a fresh start as the Black Heart, a darker, more rebellious version of himself. The plan was perfect. Owen versus Shawn for the WWF Championship. The story practically wrote itself. But the business wasn't fair. It never was. Shawn Michaels, now one of Vince's golden boys, had creative control over his matches, and he used it. He refused to work with Owen. Some said it was fear, that he thought Owen might take real shots at him in the ring for what happened in Montreal. Others said it was arrogance. Either way, the feud was dead before it began. The promised push vanished overnight. Instead, Owen was tossed into meaningless storylines, humiliated, mocked, and buried under the antics of D-Generation X. The man who once symbolized skill and heart became a punchline. Backstage, he smiled through it all, but his friends saw the change. The sparkle was fading. The business that once felt like home now felt cold and unforgiving. He was losing faith, not just in others, but in himself. Still, Owen tried to stay true to his principles. When the company began pushing more adult themes, he refused to participate in storylines he found tasteless. He turned down an angle involving an affair with Deborah McMichael, saying he didn't want his kids to see their father pretending to cheat on their mother on television. That simple act of integrity didn't go unnoticed, but it came at a cost. Vince Russo, the head writer behind the company's raunchier direction, took it personally, and Owen, whether he realized it or not, had just made a powerful enemy. In a world driven by ego and power, defiance wasn't forgiven. Owen soon found himself repackaged into his old blue blazer persona. But this time, it wasn't a heroic revival, it was a mockery. The once beloved character was turned into a joke, a self-righteous parody meant to ridicule Owen's refusal to play along with the company's sleazy storylines. It was corporate punishment disguised as entertainment. But beneath the mask, Owen was breaking. He still loved wrestling, the craft, the performance, the fans, but he hated what it had become. He hated the manipulation, the betrayals, the politics. The business had taken his brother, his peace, and now his pride. And yet, he kept showing up, because deep down, Owen Hart wasn't just another wrestler. He was a man who believed in finishing what he started, no matter the cost. But no one, not even Owen, could have predicted how tragically that cost would be paid. Because what happened next wouldn't just end a career, it would end a life. And it would leave the wrestling world asking one haunting question for decades. Was it really just an accident? May 23, 1999. The Kemper Arena in Kansas City was filled with over 16,000 roaring fans. It was supposed to be a night of laughter, nostalgia, and entertainment, a pay-per-view titled Over the Edge. But for Owen Hart, it would become the final chapter of a story written in both brilliance and tragedy. That night, behind the curtain, he prepared once again to wear the mask of the blue blazer. The same persona he had once loved, now twisted into a parody. The lights were ready, the cameras rolling, and yet something in the air felt wrong. Owen wasn't nervous about performing. He had done hundreds of matches before, But he was deeply uncomfortable with one specific detail: the stunt. He was supposed to descend from the rafters, superhero style, lowered into the ring by a harness and cable. It sounded spectacular, but it wasn't his kind of showmanship. Owen was a wrestler, not a stuntman. He had voiced his concern multiple times, telling colleagues he didn't feel safe. But this was the Attitude Era, where shock value meant ratings, and the show had to go on. As the production team made final adjustments, Owen took a deep breath. Somewhere backstage, his wife Martha was home with their children, watching the event on TV. She didn't know that this would be the moment that would change her life forever. Moments later, the camera cut away to a pre-taped segment. The crowd watched the Titantron, unaware that high above them, Owen Hart was being clipped into the harness, preparing for his dramatic entrance. Then, suddenly, it happened. A blur of blue, a horrifying thud. At first, the crowd thought it was part of the show, some kind of special effect. But within seconds, the laughter turned to silence. Owen had fallen over 70 feet, landing chest first on the top rope and bouncing into the ring. Referee Jim Corderas, who was just inches away, later recalled hearing nothing but a sickening sound, like the air being crushed out of someone's lungs. The paramedics rushed in, chaos broke out, and the broadcast cut away. The crowd stood frozen, unsure if what they had seen was real. But it was. Owen Hart lay motionless in the ring, his heart still beating, but fading fast. As medical staff worked frantically to revive him, the wrestlers backstage were in shock. Nobody could believe it. Some cried, some prayed, some just stood in stunned silence. The man who had brought laughter to everyone's lives, the prankster, the father, the brother, was fighting for his life just feet away from where he was supposed to entertain. Within minutes, the announcement came over the radio headset. Owen's gone. At just 34 years old, Owen James Hart was pronounced dead. But the show didn't stop. In one of the most controversial decisions in wrestling history, Vince McMahon ordered Over the Edge to continue. As the ring crew quietly removed the ropes and sanitized the mat, wrestlers were told to continue performing. Some refused, some broke down mid-match, and others wrestled through tears. The audience didn't fully grasp the gravity of what had happened until later that night, when commentator Jim Ross, his voice trembling, made the devastating announcement live on pay-per-view. Ladies and gentlemen, Owen Hart has tragically died tonight here in Kansas City. The world stood still. In the days that followed, heartbreak turned into outrage. Fans demanded answers. The Hart family was shattered. Bret Hart, who was working in WCW at the time, broke down when he heard the news. Martha Hart, Owen's wife, was consumed with grief, but also determination. She wanted justice. She believed Owen's death wasn't an accident, but the result of negligence and carelessness. The stunt had been planned by people who didn't fully understand the danger. The harness, designed for quick release, wasn't meant for human suspension. It was meant for theatrical props. Owen never had a chance. The lawsuit that followed would expose details that made the tragedy even harder to bear. The company had replaced the original rigging crew with a cheaper, less experienced one just days before the show. The latch that released Owen wasn't industrial grade. It could be triggered by just a few pounds of pressure. In the darkness of the rafters, while fumbling with the cape and mask, that latch released too soon. A man who spent his life protecting others had no one to protect him when it mattered most. In the aftermath, the wrestling world mourned in disbelief. Every wrestler who had ever crossed paths with Owen had a story about his kindness, his humor, his humility. He was the kind of man who made enemies into friends, the kind of performer who made others look better than himself. And yet, in death, his legacy became more than his wrestling career. It became a symbol of how easily the business he loved could destroy the very people who gave it life. Martha Hart later said that Owen was planning to retire soon. He had dreams beyond wrestling, dreams of family, peace, and a life away from the chaos of the road. He wasn't chasing titles anymore. He just wanted time he would never get. In a heartbreaking irony, his final moments were spent playing a superhero parody, when to his family, he already was one. In the years that followed, debates raged on. Should the show have stopped? Should WWE ever have approved that stunt? And could anyone have saved him? These questions still echo through every conversation about Owen Hart's death. His friends remember him not for how he fell, but for how he lived. As a man who never took himself too seriously, who loved his craft, and who made people laugh even on their worst days. Today, Owen Hart's name is spoken with reverence and sorrow. He wasn't just a performer. He was a reminder of how fragile the line between life and spectacle truly is. His wife, Martha, continues to honor him through the Owen Hart Foundation, helping others in his memory, turning tragedy into purpose. But even now, more than 2 decades later, fans can't watch that night's footage without feeling a chill deep in their hearts. Because Owen's fall wasn't just a moment in wrestling history, it was the moment wrestling lost its innocence. And so as we remember him, one question still lingers, not about blame or business or legacy, but about fate. If Owen Hart had refused that stunt, would the story of wrestling's kindest soul have ended any differently?